Good morning all, it's 10 o'clock and here we are in Pershore. Welcome to this meeting of the OSPB, and particular welcome to our guests today, Paul, Simon and Phil, for giving up their morning to come and talk to us about the emerging budget, so we're grateful to you. Before we start, there's a couple of housekeeping things we just need to quickly go through. So apologies, Richard wrote to me last night, he's got a health appointment this morning, which is why he's not here. Shirley isn't able to attend today, neither is Tim Reed. Other than that, we've got the first team here before us today, and welcome to OSPB members, and particularly my Vice Chairman. Declarations of interest of any party whip, I'm just obliged to ask you that. There are none. Public participation, we almost had a member of the public, almost, coming to talk to us this morning, but at the last moment, it isn't going to happen. Which the members of the board may wish to discuss the issue he was going to raise later when we're looking at our work programme. Confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting from 17th of October, I'm moving those as accurate. Is anyone prepared to second that motion? Everyone is prepared to second that motion. Anyone disagreeing with the accuracy of those minutes? There being none, we'll move on then. So the substantive item this morning is budget scrutiny. Attending, as I say, Simon, Paul and Phil. I'm going to ask the leader perhaps to introduce this item this morning. And really what we're interested in, Simon, is what's keeping you awake at night? Let's package the meeting in what the leader finds himself staring at the ceiling 2 o'clock in the morning thinking, how the heck are we going to resolve that issue? Or a light bulb moment when you come up with something which hadn't been thought of before. So Simon, without further ado, please address the meeting this morning and give us an idea of the emerging pressures we're likely to face.
Thanks, Tom, and good morning, colleagues. I suppose where I'd start is, of course, in terms of our budget setting process, one of the most important things is focusing on the delivery of this year's budget, which has been a record programme, some £37 million worth of changes. And I've gone back through the sort of annuals of time to see whether we've done such a thing before, and we haven't. And of course, there's the impact of inflation and, prices going up. But the context for the organisation has been a particularly challenging one. And I suppose that's where I'd start in terms of the budget. The focus on the delivery of the in-year savings that we set in terms of the budget in February has been a relentless focus of the administration. I think it's fair to say for all three of us, that's the thing that we've been heavily involved in. And of course, there were a whole series of things that were part of that, 75% of which broadly is going to plan delivered or going to be there. But there is 25% that's more sticky, more knotty, more thorny, either because the execution of those have taken longer, or the situation's moved on in terms of the possibility of achieving some of those savings. So that's where we start, I suppose, in the budget setting process. The other aspect is the in-year pressures. Because whilst we corrected the structural deficit of some £35 million in terms of the pressures that built up last year, if you remember, Chair, and also we set what we believed was a true and accurate reflection of the cost pressures for this financial year, we have seen continued pressures in really the same areas. And that's my message about the backdrop to the budget is the situation hasn't changed really in terms of what's causing pressure for the County Council. And it is children's placements in terms of the cost. The numbers have levelled out more, but actually the costs of some of those packages of care are quite eye-watering, to be honest. And obviously if a child needs bringing into care, then that's a professional judgment of our social workers, and we'd obviously support them in that judgment. They try wherever possible to keep families together, obviously keep children in their own home or in an appropriate setting. We've obviously worked on fostering and other approaches in terms of alternative provision, but sadly, many children, when they come into care, do need to go into a residential care home, which costs a lot of money. So that's one continuing pressure, and to give you an order of scale, we're probably talking an additional 7 £7 million at period 6, which is halfway through the year, which was the latest information that was published. There's also adult social care. And often when we talk about adult social care, we think of the older generation needing care in those later years, whether it's domiciliary care, residential nursing. But actually, what's happened over recent years is the pressure has tipped over into working age disability and lifelong conditions. So often when people think of adult social care, they do think of older people, and it's not decrying the care they need. Obviously, we help and support them wherever possible, try to keep them living independently for as long as possible. But actually, the working age disability pressures now account for more than 50% of that budget. And that's where you see some of the larger costs as well creeping up. The next area is obviously homeschool transport. Adult social care, about 5 million, we were seeing in terms of the pressures at period 6. Homeschool transport is still a pressure point, but we've seen quite large, steep increases in previous years. And there's probably about a £3 million pressure in terms of period 6, in terms of that particular area. And again, why is that the case? The majority of the costs are in SEND and specialist provision, and they're linked to the rise in EHCPs, the rise in the amount of transport and the destinations that those children are going. They're often travelling longer distances because actually, in terms of the education support they need, it's not in their local community. We would all like them to be obviously able to access a provision in the local community, but sometimes by the specialist nature or what's prescribed in the EHCP, that's not possible. And then the last pressure, which has been somewhat hidden, but I wouldn't want to underplay this because it's something that I think is the thing that keeps me awake at night, is the higher needs DSG overspend. Because in recent years that's been really creeping up, and it's off balance sheet at the moment by direction. That's for all councils across the UK. And you know, we were talking 10, then 20, then 40. Now we're heading for £80 million in terms of the deficit. And the trouble with it sitting off balance sheet is people forget it.
Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
We're heading towards
£80 million on the higher needs deficit in terms of servicing SEND provision. And it does take your breath away, doesn't it, Chair? When you talk of it and you put it in the context. And again, at the moment, we're not unique. If you look at the UK, I think in the last analysis, there's a £3.5 billion problem with DSG high needs overspends, and that's heading to £5 billion. £5 billion across the UK. So that's an enormous problem. And the reality is something's going to have to give there nationally. Either the legislation's going to have to change and the provision and the entitlement, or it's going to have to be funded. Because what everybody in the sector agrees, and government doesn't disagree with this, is if the override was removed, then the vast number of councils would have to declare 114, because they'd suddenly have to account for that. They would have to obviously utilise their reserves. And if you think about £80 odd million taken out of our reserves, well, that's just not possible. It just wouldn't be possible. The thing that we have to be cited on, though, is that is a real cost to the authority. Even though it's sat off balance sheet, we actually have to service that deficit. And so servicing an £80 odd million overspend is costing a number of millions of pounds. So that's hard cash each and every year, which is coming out, the borrowing coming out, all the opportunity cost of what we could do with the invested resources, which are not insignificant in the interest rates that we're seeing that you and I can go and get from a normal building society or bank now without taking any risk. So there is a cost to that. And I think those four key things are still very much the order of the day. And I think in terms of the backdrop to this year's budget, that's those costs we're still seeing coming through. And so looking to next year, when we set the budget in February time, we predicted there's something of the order of £25 million to find for next financial year. That was the gap that we set out. But of course, what I'm describing is also an overspend that's continuing in year, which we don't think is going away. There's no sign of that materially reducing. And that was at the sum of something like £12.5, £13 million. So Broadly speaking, if you add those two sums together, we're talking about another record year of savings, efficiencies, reform of the authority, even with council tax increases and even with a reasonable settlement. So I think we should not underestimate the challenge for the next financial year. And of course, we thought that inflation was going away, and to a certain extent it has. We're not seeing the kinds of levels of inflation that were eye-watering just for ordinary residents and businesses and consumers. But of course, in our world, some of that inflation isn't going away. And arguably, some inflation is coming back in the general economy as well. So the pressures on those placements, where there just isn't the placements for children, and councils are still competing for specialist placements, we all know what happens if you've got a limited supply and a high demand. It drives up the cost. The same is true in terms of specialist packages for people who need care in terms of adult social care as well. As I said, particularly on the working age and all age lifelong conditions. So that's the backdrop. Both of those we need to address. The piece of the jigsaw puzzle piece which is missing at the moment is, of course, what the government's view of all this will be. And my colleague can set out, particularly Phil, what the latest position is. But if I could summarise, the government's put out a policy statement, if you like, about the local government settlement, but we haven't actually got the figures. So the statement, which followed the Chancellor's budget, Chancellor's budget was something like 1.3 billion extra for local government. That was the headline, if you like. It was broken down into two key elements, one around adult social care and one about targeted recovery, targeted deprivation funds. But whereas we broadly know how adult social care works in terms of the formula, we normally have a 1% rule of thumb. We're not sure whether that 1% rule of thumb is going to translate into the targeted deprivation fund and recovery fund. So I think most councils would say they need support to recover. We would say we need support to deal with the cost pressures that government are asking us to do. We're doing a job on behalf of the nation, really, looking after the most vulnerable people in society, children's and adults and homeschool transport, and particularly on the SEND stuff. It's not really a local determination. Nobody gets elected to the county council and varies those to a greater or lesser extent because they're in statute and they're obviously assessed by professionals. So my argument would be if we're doing a job on behalf of the nation, we have to be adequately funded to do that. And I think if the driver is around deprivation rather than need, and the real drivers of our costs, there could be a problem there, Chair, panel colleagues, that if we don't get our 1% rule of thumb, which would be normally 7 million from that £700 million fund, that would be a particular problem. So that was the budget. Roll forward to the policy statement, things changed a little bit, so this is relatively new. Within the department, they broke those numbers down slightly differently. So they said, still we're going to give some money for adult social care. We're still going to give some money for this recovery fund, but it's going to be heavily weighted to deprivation. So those alarm bells start ringing as to whether that's really going to reflect our drivers of cost. And they conceded that actually they needed to have some targeted funding for children's social care. So that is a welcome move, but there's no clear view as to the precise formulae. So on each of those, we have to make a bit of a guesstimate. We haven't got long to wait though, because next week we're expecting the local government settlement. They have to do it by the 19th, Chair, because the 19th Parliament rises, of course, for the period over Christmas and New Year. So it is literally virtually the last day that they could publish the settlement.
Are we getting a 1-year settlement?
And we're heading for a 1-year rollover type arrangement, and in one sense a rollover of things would be nice. My worry is if some of the resources are changed within that formulae, there'll obviously be councils that would argue that's necessary, but actually for county councils and unitaries, our drivers of costs are not around deprivation. They're around the numbers of children in care, adults, requiring care, as I said, SEND provision. Those are really our drivers of cost. And so if the formulae doesn't reflect that, then we can have a problem. And then we have a very short period of time. So between next week, when we expect the settlement, and the draft budget, which we will be in this room or another part of Worcestershire debating, whichever building we're in. I think it's on the 16th of January in terms of the draft budget. And so that leaves a very short period of time to actually take what that final jigsaw puzzle piece is and put it together with all the other information, and obviously update the in-year position, because it's moving all the time, obviously trying to deliver those remaining savings, and we're also trying to keep the pressure on to see where we can limit demand. And I've talked about those. What I haven't talked about, I suppose, this morning is all the other good things that we're doing. You know, we continue to invest in Worcester's infrastructure, the environment, the economy of Worcestershire, supporting lots of things that people would argue are non-statutory to a certain extent, or that we don't need to do. But I firmly believe that actually the council's role is more than just statutory provision. If we got to that point, Chair, there wouldn't be much point in. We don't need a council. We could have an agency of government, like DVLA or something, which basically works to officials and civil servants. You only need local politicians if there's an element of local discretion, and therefore that can be contested. People can make choices, and whoever the administration is can implement those choices. And so I think shaping Worcestershire's future in terms of the economy, environment, the place we live in, actually is incredibly important for local people. And so that's the thing that, to a certain extent, gets squeezed by these pressures. And we're always battling, I suppose, to keep those resources, to have some level of discretion. I've probably gone on a bit too long, Chair, but I've just wanted to set the scene for you about the key competing
Simon, you
issues.
did it brilliantly. But as you were speaking, I'm absolutely certain questions were popping into people's minds. And I'm going to go around the room in a bit, but I'm going to indulge myself first of all, and then I'm going to go down. Everyone's going to have a chance. Have you, anticipating next week's settlement, and you were very generous in perhaps not setting out the potential for a seismic reconfiguration of national government funding towards deprivation. No surprise, given the change of colour, but where Worcestershire sits in that new modelling is a concern, I think. I think you're telling us that. You were you could have been more explicit if you know, we would have forgiven you if you had been more explicit. I guess it's a question for Phil, though, really. We're not just sitting there waiting for the 18th to come and the settlement. We must be doing some modelling now about what that might look like in various scenarios, given X investment or Y investment. What would that look like in terms of next year's budget? Phil, have you been doing any modelling and if you could give us a clue as to what that, you know, the best case scenario, worst case scenario might look like?
Yes, certainly. Good morning, everybody. I think I'll just touch on the sort of policy statement in a little bit more detail than Simon's gone through. So the recovery grant, there's 600 million nationally, but it depends what formula they use. If they used the usual 1%, would get 7 million, but the indications from modelling and from experts and roundtables with Section 151, it's going to be targeted to deprivation. So I'm being pessimistic, but I don't think we'll get a lot of that because they're going to funnel that somewhere else, and they're going to use council tax levels and sort of deprivation formula in terms of that. In terms of social care, in the budget strategy and our MTFP, we assumed we would get an extra 5 million a year. That 600 million's gone to increase to 680 million, which is helpful. So we'll get a little bit extra in terms of that. So that's helpful. The children's social care preventative grant, that's 250 million nationally. So we could get around our 1% is either 2.5 million, but they're going to use the children's relative needs formula. So I think it might be a little bit less than that. I think one of the issues that's gone through, services grant, we get that. That's been abolished, so we're going to lose 443,000 straight away. So that's definite. There's the rural services delivery grant. Worcestershire doesn't get any of that, but a number of county councils do. That's been abolished. So I know colleagues that have got 10 million gone, 12 million, 8 million gone. in terms of that. So that's something around that. And in terms of DSG, along with the settlement, they're going to put a bit of policy around if they're going to extend that statutory override. So as we've discussed earlier, we've had the formula gross. We'll get an extra 7 million of the 1 billion a year, which, if I'm being honest, doesn't even touch the sides of the pressures that we've got. So it's going to be a really tough settlement, and government, even in terms of our spending power, assuming that all local authorities go to the maximum of council tax of 4.99, which we've assumed in our modelling. So when you add all those up, it's going to be a really tough and difficult budget.
If you were to take an analogy, a recent analogy with weather warnings, would your warning to OSPB this morning in terms of the potential budget pressures emerging and the likely government settlement be a red warning? Inherent danger? Would it be an amber warning saying we're in difficult territory, but we're probably going to get through it okay? Which of those two would it be? I can't imagine any other scenario. Maybe that's a question for the politicians. So I want to hear from your lips whether the current situation, if you equate it to a weather warning, would it be red or amber or green?
I suppose people always get criticised for having a lower warning, don't they? So prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so, you know, on your weather warning analogy, I think we've got to say, if you looked at the key things that we're facing as an authority and as a sector, because it's a sector-wide issue really for counties and unitaries, then you would you would brace for a level of impact, wouldn't you, Chair, in terms of that. So you would be in your red warning territory, I think. I think preparing for anything other than that would not be wise in the current scenario. And if it turns out, and there's obviously a lot of lobbying, so one of the things I didn't say is there's a huge amount of effort being put in by CCN colleagues that have been successful in previous years. If we think about it last year, the government it had a lot of pressure, and of course the dynamics of the government was quite different, and the impact of individual MPs, I would suggest, was probably more powerful than the current government. But the government did listen, put some more money in the last minute, and that did make a difference. So CCN are obviously marshalling the arguments around, as I said, particularly some of the SEND pressures, because those deficits are getting eye-wateringly high, and the amount of money going in is negligible to address them. And without a statutory override, why do I worry about that is the key problem. The statutory override comes off in 26. And so whilst we have to plan for 25, 26, we also have to look forward as to whether we've got a viable authority. And without that statutory override in place or a plan by government, we haven't got a viable authority. And so I always look to, yes, the immediate year, but where are we heading the next number of years? So they are doing all that pressure and that lobbying. Whether that will have any effect this year, I'm probably have limited optimism, but I remain still somebody that always thinks, well, you know, ultimately if the evidence points to those pressures, then eventually they become irresistible addressing one way or another. It might be in changes in legislation. That's the other thing. Obviously, a large majority, the government, they talk about change when actually there might be some changes in terms of what we are required to do and to what level.
Okay, it's not usually my paper of choice, the Daily Telegraph, but today's paper includes a reference to what you're talking about, and then the headline is 8 billion special needs black hole to hit councils, which kind of resonates, I think, with what you're telling us this morning. I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to go down the line. I'm going to do it in order that I can see you, so everyone has a chance. Karen is first.
Thank you. So probably a question for Phil, I should think, but you mentioned the autumn budget and then the £6 million plus for social care and the deprivation. And in reality, is that new money, which has been announced, just going to end up covering national insurance increases and wage increases amongst agency providers? And will it even cover that?
I'll touch on that. Thanks, Karen. I think the Treasury, when we'll get the settlement, our direct cost for national insurance employers, national insurance will get a grant from the Treasury for our own staff. So we'll see what the devil in the detail is that. But you're right, in terms of the social care, 680 million, that will cover the direct costs that we're facing in terms of demand and cost pressures. The issue in terms of the autumn budget and the settlement, the actual costs that impact on providers isn't factored anywhere. So that's a pressure that's coming towards us. So we're going to have a strategic approach about how do we do that, because effectively it's not in our resource envelope, and government have been quite clear around that. So there's some unintended consequences from my point of view around what's that going to do to our adult social care market, children's, anyone who employs staff are going to be coming to the council to ask for additional resources. And when you've just heard what we've just said, we haven't got the funding to do that. So there's going to be some really difficult decisions around those strategic approaches as how we commission those services for the council.
Just to add to what Phil said, thank you, Chair. Absolutely, you're right. It's not enough, nowhere near enough. We've done some modelling on what we think potentially those costs could be, and they're in, 10 million plus. If it all came through and we allowed it all, if we simply paid for them for the numbers that they've got. So what that really means is we've got to squeeze the market. And of course, we've been squeezing the market for a number of years. And so it gets increasingly difficult each year. And cost and complexity are going up anyway. Inflation has dropped back a little bit, but of course it's dropped back where the prices are still high. So we've not seen any reduction in price. So we had all of that inflation. Yes, it's not going up as quickly, but it's still going up. And so the proportion that we are spending on adults and children's social care is constantly going up in the council. It used to be about 60%. It's well over 70% now in terms of our net budget, and moving towards 75 and beyond. There are some councils that are beyond 80%. So, we are not alone in this, but we are all as a sector and as a national position in terms of local government. There is not enough money in the higher tiers at the moment to deliver adults and children's. Everybody is struggling with that. Now, some are in a better position. They've got much bigger reserves, or they've got a bigger council tax base, but everybody is on this trajectory, and we are talking to those. They will all end up where we are at some point as their reserves get depleted. If you start with a bigger amount, you've got more time, haven't you? But it is a really difficult position that we are in.
If we were a company, would we be filing for, bankruptcy? Would we be, if this were a business, is it actually viable?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And
So what's
that
the
really
answer?
depends on the devil in the detail, doesn't it? So if the grants come through as they were historically, and we were to get 6 of that, the 6 million and 7 million, then we're much closer to where we need to be. If we only get 1 million or 2 million of that 7 million, suddenly we've got a £6 million gap with a stroke of a pen. Nothing has changed in Worcestershire. Nothing has changed in our costs. If we get, as we did, we were turning the curve on children's. The numbers were coming down into care. 2 weeks ago, we had a sibling group of 4 children who had to come into care. They added 2 million to our base bill in 1 week. 4. Well, if they're in for the full year. If they're in for the full year, they will cost us that. And that's the estimate. And so you can imagine we're doing efficiency, we're doing management reductions, we're doing vacancy freezes and various other things to bring our costs down. But of course, they don't bring down £2 million in 4 weeks.
That sort of budget pressure, because you've been squeezing the orange for years. The pips have
So
popped out
it
ages
is
ago.
frustrating because it is at a stroke of a pen, and if we need those grants to come in the way that they were historically provided, and we also need long-term for viability for the fair funding review to come through, which they are promising as government next year. where they will look at demand-led services, and that's the fundamental issue.
And
At the moment,
a two-year settlement would be something that would
well,
be
they're
very
talking
helpful.
about a multiple-year settlement, but the
when-
real
but
issue
when?
is, well, they're talking about doing this fair funding review next year.
I think just to add to that, because your question is absolutely spot on, Chair, which is you know you have to constantly, and it isn't our judgment actually as politicians. The viability question falls to a 151 write-off at every budget where Phil has to look at the situation and say, are we a going concern? Have we got enough resilience, etc., etc. And so I think where we're heading for this year is we've got a one-year settlement. We're not going to get any more than a one-year settlement. But what we do as a sector have to do is we have to make sure that we're influencing government's thinking that this additional money for deprivation cannot be at the expense of demand-led services. And those demand-led services for children's and adults and SEND and homeschool transport are irresistible pressures. They're not pressures that are locally determined. They're determined by statute and by the government of the day. So I've got a very clear view on this. The government either has to change the legislation or the way we're inspected, which holds us to account to those standards, or it has to fund them. Because the reality is, if it doesn't do that, it won't have viable local government in England. That's not going to, at some point, there will be enough councils under pressure that will reach that tipping point. Now, whether we can get through with a one-year settlement, if it's a fair wind to a brighter future with a long-term funding based on demand-led services, which is, I think, where we all would want to see, that's the key question. And I would hope that we'll certainly have more certainty after next week, but that is definitely something that's a live question.
Not so much supplementary, but I've got another sort of comment to make, really. So the OBR, you know, in terms of what you're saying about us not being viable, the OBR forecast for business 26-27 was to say that 76% of the impact of employers' national insurance would be passed on through lower wages, leaving 24% of the cost to affect profits. But then local authorities are disproportionately affected. We're not a profit-making enterprise. Therefore, it has to be met by the taxpayers. So it just doesn't work at all. Nothing is going to work.
I didn't talk in the summary about the other impacts of government policy, but the national insurance one is definitely a really serious one for local authorities, because the reality is the provider market is competitive. There are providers out there. And there's always innovation going on, and you know, people in any business know that they have to adapt to survive and to compete. That's the nature of businesses. Not all businesses will succeed, etc. But what we are seeing, certainly the signs of, is businesses really starting to worry about the future now in terms of those additional costs. And they don't apply just to local government, they across the business community. And that will be affected by people maybe recruiting fewer people, less investment in terms of being able to redeploy those profits to invest. But for us, the key thing is we're in a bind because we can't absorb those pressures onto our books. Otherwise, we wouldn't be viable without additional funding, which the government's saying they're not going to give us to support those costs. So the pressure has to be transmitted to the companies to say, how can you do things differently to be able to reduce your costs? The danger is we undermine the sector, and that will certainly happen in some parts of the UK. Whether it will happen here or not is yet to be found, because you never quite know how what the point of viability is till you see companies handing back contracts and saying, we won't provide your services, I'm sorry, we can't do that within the amount you're paying us. How close individual companies are to doing that. Remembering we spend hundreds of millions of pounds in the marketplace. So our staffing bill are probably 90 million, 100 million, that kind of thing. But it's a couple 100 million plus in the marketplace. So whilst the government's saying it's going to reimburse the individual pressures for individual councils and direct employees, they're not giving that underwriting commitment to the marketplace, and they're not giving us the funds to do that. So there is a big issue there. And I definitely think there will be a hit in terms of the private sector next year, which people are predicting and they're starting to see.
Karen, Just before I come to Tony, we would usually perhaps have a look at a medium-term financial plan as setting the landscape for the budget. Does such a thing exist?
Yeah, when we set the budget in February, there was an MTFP, and I review that on a regular basis in terms of that. But it's, as Simon's already touched today, there's a gap of around 25 million plus the recurrent overspends that we've got in adults, children's, homeschool transport. So we know what that exists, but the issue that we have is the longer term, because the government's very clear on what the settlement is this year, but there's going to be a fair funding review, there's going to be multi-year settlements. So to elongate that out, we don't know what the grants are going to be in terms of that. We've got a good estimate in terms of where we're going to go, but it's going to change because they haven't done a fair funding review or review of the formula for over 11 years. But we've got good, we're pretty good at...
Phil, thank you. But what you seem to be telling us what you're telling us this morning is pretty dire, first of all.
Yeah.
Far worse than I expected, and I wasn't expecting a particularly cheery presentation, but this is really quite grave, isn't it? I mean, back to my newspaper, the IFS report warned local authorities have built up deficits that are likely to total 3.3 billion this year.
DSG.
I mean, and what you're saying this morning is kind of chiming even with it's not charming, it's chiming with what I'm reading. Phil, I'm just going to press you on the medium-term financial plan. What you appear to be saying, we usually would have a 24, 25, 25, 26, 26, 27, cost pressures, efficiency savings, and so on and so forth. And we would usually have a look at that. But what you appear to be saying, Phil, is because there's so many uncertainties, the fair funding review, and all the other situations that, you know, what next week may or may not bring, it's pretty almost impossible to put in table form what things might look like because we've got so many things that we don't know.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's a fair summary for 25, 26. We're obviously going to have to set a budget, a legal budget. Otherwise, we're not in business if we can't do that with enough resilience that gets us through. But from 26, 27, particularly with that statutory override coming off, which is I keep referring to that, at the moment, as we sit here, we have no certainty whether that statutory override would be renewed in 26. And if it wasn't, that 80 plus million pounds and whatever extra is added to the deficit next year is it's 80 million pounds at the end of this year. So at that going rate could be over 100 million pounds. We've got to service that. If that fell onto the books of the council, we wouldn't be a going concern. And so that longer term view is very uncertain because of that override, which is why it goes back to the key question you asked, what keeps me awake at night. Long-term viability does link to that. There's also, if the government was to restructure local government finances and let's say follow the pattern of what it's indicating for this year, which is to move more money to deprivation, maybe metropolitan and urban areas, effectively, that would undermine significantly the ability to us to survive into the future, because what we have been getting, admittedly not enough money, but at least reasonable sums of money for demand-led social care. And if that switch happened, that would be a fundamental problem, I think, for counties and unitaries. Yeah.
And just to give the panel a bit more assurance, so in terms of the county council's accounts, they should hopefully be signed off this week. We had audit and governance last Friday, so we have not got a backlog like some other local authorities. We've had our VFM opinion for this year that's been considered by the audit and governance, so no changes to our accounts. So we know we've got a good track record of doing that, so that's helpful. The risks in the VFM report that the auditors highlighted are the same that we've been saying today. Your high needs deficit and your financial sustainability of the council going forward, and some of that is, and that is no different from every county council or upper tier authority up and down the country. There's this level of uncertainty because of the change in government and the lack of clarity on the sort of medium term. So the focus for us is obviously the 25, 26 in the short term, balancing the budget, and then we'll feed through. But I think just to be aware some of the pressures that Simon said around county councils network. I sit on a group, national group with the DFE and with CCN on children's social care placements. I sit on a group with Mark Fitton on the adults, sort of younger age adults. So what we're trying to do is influence the spending review that will come in March to try and say, so Worcestershire's voice is heard loud and strong around the pressures that we face in terms of demand-led services.
And I presume that involves you guys schmoozing with our MPs of all different colours, because they're our representatives. They're the people who, whatever the colour, are there hopefully to fight with a single voice. I'm conscious that lots of people haven't spoken, so I'm going to go to Paul, quick one, then I'm going to go to Tony.
I just wanted to say, Chair, we do have an MTFP, and we can give you the current MTFP. That's not a problem. And we will have an MTFP for this budget. The reason we haven't got it now is because we haven't got the settlement. And there are just too many variables. We'd be saying to you, if this, it's that. If it's Y, it's Z. If it's, A, it's B. There are just too many spinning plates at the moment. So once we get past next week, we will update our MTFP, and you will be able to see that as we move through towards the budget. We have to have one. Phil has to do an opinion on our viability whenever we set a budget.
I know.
We currently have one. It's the approximation of what we thought growth would be this year. And of course, what we're informing you of is growth has been significantly higher than that, despite our efforts to bring that cost down.
Okay. Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So, who would want to be a councillor at this present time? And I'm sure the population and our residents are saying you're making the decisions for us. But when I look at what we've got and what we've got to deal with, do we then look at how we can remodel within legislation what we do deal with? Because I realise, Phil, that you deal with the numbers, and then it's down to the administration and down to Paul to make sure that administration follows the guidelines. And do we look? I mean, homeschool transport is a big one to deal with, and when you look at that, I know there are a few, and we're only talking about a few number of people that sort of require that when you look at the whole of Worcestershire. But the homeschool transport, when you look at the facilities that are given, home adaptions to the house, special vehicle, adapted vehicle, and then on top of that, there's home to school transport provided. And you think, well, hang on, we've just provided a special vehicle, there's adaptions to the home, and when the unfortunate thing happens, and I know a family that this has happened to, the child has passed on, the pain in the home is too much for the family, so the family move off. That adapted house, with all the finance that's been spent on that house, the additional rooms that have been built, the house gets sold. We don't see a penny of that come back, as far as I can understand it. It all stays within the family. Which, do we look at sort of some change to say, well, if we're spending a quarter of a million or $500,000 on adapting your home, is there a financial comeback on that? And also, if you've got an adapted vehicle, should you not be using that vehicle? And if legislation, which it doesn't at the moment, I know it doesn't allow us to do that, then do we look at providing our own transport for home to school, where we don't pick up one child, we pick up 4 children within that postcode or whatever?
So then I get the general gist of the question, Tony, which is, so I suppose if I zoom out, I think it's absolutely the job of any administration, whatever colour, to constantly review how you do things differently. And you have to do that, whatever your resources. And in every walk of life, if your resources are constrained, you have to innovate, you have to look at how you can do things differently, and you have to try and live within your means. And that's absolutely what we will continue to try to do. And I wouldn't want anyone to leave this meeting today or viewing online thinking that the administration of Worcestershire County Council is simply going to sit back and say, well, we're doomed, we can't do anything, the die is cast. That's not the case. We will continue to look and reform. But I always like to be honest with people that we are constrained by legislation, and we are a creature of legislation in that sense. And so we have an ability to lobby and influence, but we don't set the law. And we're measured and inspected on a regular basis. And so and we have been heavily criticised, along with many other councils, for whether we're doing enough to meet specialist provision in terms of SEND, whether we're doing our EHCPs quick enough, whether particularly health are making those assessments, because much of the criticism was around whether the health assessments were being done in a timely fashion. But when they are done, and once the provision is set, then that obviously our job is to deliver the EHCP, to make sure that what's prescribed in it is delivered. And if we prescribe something that is unsuitable, or in the parent's view or in professional's view doesn't meet the need, there's an appeals process. And 90% of the appeals go against local authorities, not Worcestershire, across the country. So if you've got an appeals system where 90+% are found in favour of the person bringing the case, you have to be careful that you're not simply going through a process that's limiting provision, and then an appeal is simply putting it back in, because that's not helping anyone. It's not helping the families of people with profound conditions. It's not helping the taxpayer. It's not helping the council. It's helping no one. So I think where we've got very prescribed processes and systems and laws in place, there is also a duty on the government of the day to say, is that appropriate? Is that affordable? Can the people who are being asked to administer the system actually make it work? And I think there's a growing view across the UK that the law probably does need reform in that area, in home-to-school transport. Some aspects of home-to-school transport, the law's quite old, actually, in terms of the walking distances and things like that. They go back many, many, many decades. So that is the job of government. Our job is to highlight the issues, to lobby, to use our representatives, as you said, to raise the concern, to try and change the law where we think that collectively isn't working, isn't right, and we've got evidence to prove that. And in the meantime, it's to look at, to see how we can innovate. And we are looking at some of the things you describe. How could we use the voluntary sector? How could we use our own fleet in certain cases, if that's more effective and efficient than using the private sector? And it's right and proper that we do that, and we'll continue to do that. But I'd like to be honest about the ability for us to, I think if we can stem the rate in which the budget is going up, that will be success. Bringing the budget down, I can't find virtually any council, and you've got wider knowledge, that's actually doing that. That the success is stopping the rate of incline in the budget and limiting that as far as possible. And that, of course, goes back to the overall slice of the cake that's being spent on children's and adults' homeschool transport.
Okay, I'm fascinated by that. I'm just trying to keep hold of Tony's question, Tony's line of inquiry there. In terms of ensuring, where possible, people live independent lives in their own home, be it whatever age they may be, and the opportunity that DFGs might provide to deliver that outcome and reduce our cost pressures. Clearly, DFGs are organised by district councils, and I've long time thought that we could do more, because it's in our interest as a county, to a £5,000 adaptation for walking shower or stair lift or something. It might be the difference between going into private care, which would then burden us. So, and then Tony's point was, well, actually, if you do the adaptations, will be it minor or more significant, and the property is subsequently sold, does the public sector ever get that returned investment back? I think was something else you were asking. So could we come on to those points?
Yeah, I can come on to those, having done DFGs for many years. The simple answer is no, we can't get the money back. There are some cases where there may be some options, but it's very rare. Primarily, you do the house up and it's sold on. If it's in a council property, So we've done it in council properties. We've even had the situations in the past where the tenant moves out or sadly passes on. And then we've gone in and you know, done the refurb effectively for the new tenant and taken out all of the adaptations. That has got better in recent years, where we try and identify a new tenant that would benefit from those adaptations, but it is only in the public stock. So yes.
Can I just interrupt you to ask you specifically why it is we can't put a charge on the property?
The legislation doesn't allow us to.
Okay, so we need to lobby for that, because
It's a
that
grant.
would be a big change, wouldn't it? If we could say that £10,000 investment was then recycled at the future sale, and then we could have a pot of money that we could continue to reinvest.
That's why it's a DFG. It's a grant. It
Yeah.
is not a loan.
So we need to lobby on this, because if we can find a way of creating something where it's not just money being lost, 5k
Yep.
there, 10k there, but recycled as a charge against property, that's not impossible. It might need legislation to achieve it, but that would be that would be a game changer.
It would certainly help. I think experience from putting charges on properties, it's not as simple as people think. If you think of our adult social care debt at the moment, if you look at our debt level, we've spent the last 2 years really bringing our debt levels down, chasing debt, driving debt down. A lot of that to do with home care costs. And even though you can put a charge onto those people, if they die with nothing, it's difficult to get. And then, of course, the relatives don't want to pay the care cost. And you end up in appeal, and you end up in all kinds of legislative nightmares to try and recover that money. Often it's very drawn out and protracted, and often it's not that huge amount of money. It might be 10 or 15,000 pounds. It might cost you 50 to get it. And it's, you know, so there's all kinds of conundrums that are in this. What we need is simple, straightforward legislation, as Tony talks about. And similarly, the position on if you have Motability, it has nothing to do with your EHCP at all. And interestingly, the same about if we want to run our own fleet and collect 2 or 3 children in a postcode rather than just one. That's not how. It's not up to us. It is up to their parent, and it is up to the child, and it's done by need. So if there is a need for that child, maybe they have autism and they need to be in a quiet space on their own, they will get their own transport. And even if we say, no, it's much cheaper for us to pick you up with 2 others, their parent can insist that we do it separately. So the legislation is absolute. It's really clear in what it means we have to do. Hence all of these things. Similarly, we could build a new school, and we are looking at this, or adapted classrooms in locations in Worcestershire to stop having to transport children so far. That's one of the things we are looking at, but it's still the parental choice as to whether they send them there. So
I'm
you
going to
cannot
come
insist on it.
Thanks. I mean, the whole inclusion agenda 20 years ago.
Yes, it's
has
still the same.
Yeah, and the removal of special schools. One in Thornton House in Worcester, I seem to recall, hasn't helped actually, really, has it?
Well, we do need to get more children into mainstream school.
But we also need to provide education.
But we need to provide the facilities and the
Yeah.
ability to teach them in that location.
Yeah, which seems to be the problem. We seem to have lost that local. Emma made the point
Simply
earlier
aren't
about
the
that.
staff out there to do it.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
So, Alistair.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's a pity this meeting's this week, isn't it? Because if it's next week, we might know the financial settlement, and the medium-term financial plan would be a lot clearer. So, so really, rather than trying to look into a crystal ball, I really want to look at where we are currently in our budget and the pressures that Simon talked about. He mentioned some figures, and 7 million over budget on children's placement. 5 million over budget on adult social care, and 3 million over on home to school transport. And home to school transport is an area that I've spent a lot of time on in the last 18 months, because it was first flagged to our panel that there was pressure on that back in November 2020, so it's a long time ago. And then you mentioned about the higher needs DSG. DSG is the Dedicated Schools Grant, and it's broken down into 4 areas, and the higher needs block is the one that is all the pressure that's in the newspaper from SEND and the legislation that David Cameron pushed through on EHCPs. And from our panel last week, we heard that there's a 27% growth in EHCPs. So when you look at that, if we move that it is a legislation problem on SEND and EHCPs, and there's an 8 billion black hole across all councils. And naturally, we'll do everything we can to get our point across to central government with all the other councils to try and get some sense into that legislation. But if we go back into what we can do, one is efficiency. And I hear what Paul said about the legislation. It hinges on what's written in the EHCP. But, our own officers have quite a part to play in actually writing those EHCPs. And therefore, we need to make sure that there is flexibility in the way they're written. And a lot of children who have got special needs could benefit from actually going in a minibus with other children because it's improving their social skills, etc. So we need to look on how we can overcome this problem, on how we can use minibuses, how we can use less taxis, and how we can get those children to schools on a more local level. And I know David Chambers is already looking at how we can upskill some of our local schools to take more SEND children. But this is really a question for Paul, and that is efficiency, all right? I know that we're constrained with other grants. I know we're constrained by legislation, but there's things we can do. And we've been pushing this since 2020, November 2020. What are we doing to improve our efficiency in taking kids with SEND to school, home to school transport? Our budget was £23 million last financial year. We overspent by 12 million, all right, last year, and it was all fought through SEND. The normal home to school transport, which is 2,700 pupils a week, absolutely fine. It's about 10 million quid. It's been about 10 million quid for a number of years. But the special education needs has gone up tremendously. 12 million last year. Because it was a structural deficit, we put that onto this year's budget. So we went from 23 million to 35 million. I was gobsmacked that at my first panel meeting, when we were looking at Q1 figures, the forecast was an overspend of 3 million. So in the first 3 months of this year, our own department had said, I know that we put on 12 million last year for special education need transport, but we're already forecasting an overspend of 3 million. Surely, Paul, there's things we can do to improve and reduce costs on home to school transport for special education needs. All right, what are you doing about it? And that's my question.
So it's a very good question, and it's not an easy answer. So the legislation, as I've said, sets out a lot of parental choice in this, and it also, you're right to say we do write the EHCPs, an element of it. The fundamental issue about need, though, is written by colleagues in the NHS, so the occupational therapists or their child psychologists, which is not directly in our control. And we do have to be careful about stepping into professional areas we're not qualified in. There is also the ability for parents to go privately to get their OT, because there's been such a long waiting time, or their educational psychologist. And you tend to find that where you have the private ones done, they are very much driven by the people who are providing the information, rather than necessarily an independent, objective person that's employed. And you would expect that, and rightly so. So it's not as simple as you saying, so if this was in highways, I can see your point. How much tarmac we put down, how much do I buy it at, how much am I going to put down, where am I going to put it, how am I going to do it in the best and most efficient way of doing it. The problem with this is that a lot of it is not in our control. So a lot of it is driven by people's expectation and ability to reference that directly in the legislation. Most of the things we do, we don't have that. There's a grey area where there is a debate and there is a position that you can come to. That's where you can operate in your efficiency position. When you talk about how do we limit it, one of the things that has happened here, if you go back to that same time period that you talk about, we were operating at a time where we were doing EHCP significantly below the national target. We were effectively operating because we couldn't get the staff. We'd just come out of COVID, and had a backlog of applications. If you remember, people were waiting and complaining about the numbers of weeks. We had an inspection, we had a send action plan, and we have dramatically improved the speed at which we do the EHCPs. They're still telling us from Ofsted that we're not going quickly enough, and we still have another action plan that we have to agree with the DFE that is being put in there. So again, it's not directly in our control as a council as to what we have to do, when we have to do it, and how we do it, because DFE are doing intervention to that degree. The home to school transport element, we are really on we can't affect the demand side because we can't slow down the number of applications that are coming through. And what happened is, once we started to speed up our applications, you saw the budget rise. Because for every HCP we're getting, you started to get home to school transport things. We were limiting it before that because effectively we couldn't get the applications through quickly enough. So it kept our budget artificially low. What has happened since that point, because we've taken off the brakes, effectively, when they come in, we're doing it much quicker, it feeds through into the budget much quicker. So that's why you're seeing it. There is a national position where more and more children are being diagnosed. Now, whether that is an over-medicalisation, there are things in the papers at the moment that are talking about medicalisation of children. Is it behaviour? Is it ADHD? Is it autism? What is it? Are we moving the spectrum too far to actually diagnose children? There is some talk about whether an EHCP is a ticket for additional help for children at school, and therefore parents want them because it gives them extra reassurance about what their child will get. So we're fighting all of that. On the efficiency argument, we are looking at, can we locate facilities nearer to where they want to be, which is one of the points that came out of scrutiny. We are looking about using our own fleet, which we are doing. We are also looking at the cost to the general population of children in terms of the pass fare that we charge, because we were lower than many other counties, so we're looking at that. We have brought in new systems about being able to map where children are, where they're going to, and what is the most accessible route. One of the things for me, if you think about it, and you'll know this from business, Alistair, is that what you try to do is understand where you could get the best efficiency gain. One of the key problems with home to school transport is they all start at the same time. If we could somehow have a differentiated day, because we're trying to get taxis or any form of transport in 1 hour slots, and so it's like anything. If you've too much work in that hour, they push the price up in order to be able to buy it. If you could spread it, we'd get a better price for it. Even though they'd still be going in taxis, we'd get a lot cheaper price because people aren't trying to get to work, people aren't trying to do various other things. So we are looking at that, and we are talking to some schools about that. But again, it's not something I can say, you will do that. All we can do is negotiate that position. If we can get to a point where we do it in-house, and I'm cynical about the in-house route, because when you think about staff terms and conditions, holiday levels, vehicle costs that we buy at compared to others, I find it hard to see how we are cheaper. People are modelling it, they're looking at it, but I come at that with a cynical view. Having run fleet for many years, I have colleagues who run fleet in the private sector who can do it probably at half the price we could. Now, we can never get those prices because we're a local authority, and whether you believe that's a fixing of the market or not, it's the case in a lot of our industry areas that we do. Building is the same, because we have to have everything absolutely right, the health and safety, the assessments, everything else. We've gone into bigger contracts. We've looked at providing them with police and various others. Public sector does pay more. There is no doubt. You'll know that from the private sector. But we can be more efficient. We are looking at the routing. We've done a lot of work on software now, and I think there is a very keen drive from the portfolio holder, who is Adam Kent. Those that know him, he's very keen to drive that business approach. And we are starting to get traction in E&I.
I hear what you say, Paul, but what have we actually done since the beginning of this year, from the 1st of April, that has improved our efficiency? I know that you've talked about buying 50 new minibuses to replace the ageing fleet at Warndon, but I haven't heard, has it moved forward or not? Don't know anything about it. You have got 70 drivers you've got 50 drivers and 70 additional people at Warndon that are people that have to sit with the disabled people or people with special education. Chaperones. Thank you for that. I was trying to remember the word. So you've got all of those as well there. And so that is a big cost. We've got a Warndon in-house. And then on top of that, we're spending £1.5 to £2 million a month with taxis. And when you look at the home-to-school transport for 2,700 employees, that 2,700 kids that go to school, normal schools, every day, and that's only 10 million, and then you look at how much we're spending on send, it's just eye-watering. It is really eye-watering, and I just can't believe there aren't efficiencies. And one of the things our panel have been pushing has been, we have 13 community organisations in the UK, all right, in Worcestershire, 13 community organisations. Some of them have minibuses, all right, and they take people to hospitals, to dentists, to supermarkets, all right. They do have some contracts with the Worcestershire County Council for adult social care and children's services, but not a huge amount. We give them £90,000 grant a year, and it's been stuck now for several years. It's a huge opportunity to use the community transport to help us with this issue with send. And rather than buying 50 minibuses for Warndon, why don't we help those community organisations build their fleet? So, there are ways of looking at this, different ways to skin a cat, as they say. There must be opportunities where we can reduce the cost for send home-to-school transport.
Absolutely couldn't agree with you more. And there are opportunities. Of all those things that you've talked about, we've looked at all of them. It doesn't mean to say people want that contract. We need to be really clear about what we're asking people to do. We're asking people to go out of their way to pick up one child and possibly transport them 30 or 40 miles. This child may not be mobile. This child may be sat in the back of the car perfectly calm and then suddenly absolutely create. It is not the same as taking people to hospital in a minibus. It is absolutely not the same. So I don't disagree there are efficiencies and we must continue to look for them. But I really think you're oversimplifying the problem. I really do. Because the legislation gives the parent the choice. So if you say we'll pick you up in a voluntary minibus, they can say, no, you won't. I want a taxi. And if their OT report says in their EHCP that they can have individual transport, then they can have it. And we will lose at tribunal. And this is the problem. Because if it was just about, I think that there's a point in your point that we are very good and very efficient at mass transport. We move all those children there and back very cheaply. So it's not that we don't know how to do it, and it's not that we don't know how to do it efficiently. What we are is boxed in with a serious number of pieces of legislation and very specific. There is no wriggle room in that legislation. We've asked cases, we've looked at case law, we've looked at everything to say, can we say no? And the answer is, no, you can't. We've run it, we've taken it, and we've lost. So, yes, there is efficiency, but if I'm brutally honest, it's round the margins until somebody changes the legislation. And this is the point, which comes back to Simon's, is they either need to change the legislation or they need to fund it. Now, the government clearly don't want to fund it because of the amount of money it is. You're right, I couldn't disagree more. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on the point of spending £40 million to move a small number of children to school and back is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. There is a better way, but it will have to come with legislation. So we are looking for it, we are lobbying for it, as are CCN. We are talking to everybody else who does home to school transport to say, are we missing something? Have we not done something that we could do? Nobody has got a magic bullet. Yes, we could use our fleet internally more. We are looking at that. John Hobbs is looking at that. He's bringing together a paper that will price it. Now, if he's not doing that quickly enough at the moment, he's not in work at the moment, but I will push on that, and that is on our work plan, and we are pushing to make sure. I've talked to you about that before, about, you know, if we've already got the vehicles and we've already got the staff, then actually it's opportunity cost. It's not additionality cost, and that, I think, is where you can get the efficiency. I'm more nervous about the voluntary sector. I would love to give the work to the voluntary sector. It's just whether or not they are able to take it on, they can make it profitable for them. I don't want to give them something that then passes them the financial burden. I've got to make sure that if we're going to give it to the voluntary sector, it works, it's efficient, and they can make enough money to make it pay for them, which we clearly can't on home to school transport at the moment.
Just one last thought, which is, often when we're talking about this and the chaperones, they go, oh, but you don't understand, Alistair, you know, some of these children, as you just said, you know, could kick off, and, you know, and the point is, yes, there are extremes, but it's a bell curve, all right? And the vast majority of the children on EHCP, right, have some learning difficulties, but they're not at the spectrum, and they're quite happy to go in a minibus together. All right, and the interesting
thing... Those are the ones
thing,
we are shipping.
That's the question I'd really like you to answer, Paul. What have we done since the 1st of April this year till now to reduce costs in home to school transport? Because I've asked this question and I haven't been given any examples of what you've actually done. So I would like to know exactly what you've actually done to reduce costs from the 1st of April. And we've had conversations at the beginning of this year, in January and February, about this very subject. And, you know, so if outside this meeting, please have a look, come back to me and wow me with all those initiatives that we've actually implemented, rather than talked about, that has actually saved this council money.
So the one I can absolutely tell you about now is we have implemented a system where we can map where all people, where the children live, where they are going to, and what is the primary route that they can use, and is there a better way of doing it? That is a massive data position. The things you talk about are big pieces of work. We've done that. We've also worked with an external consultant to look at how we can bring down the costs of that and the action plan. It should have been reported to your committee. I don't understand why it hasn't been, because it's certainly been to SLT.
Well, we haven't had any specific examples, and that's what we're pushing for. And we keep saying, you know, what are we doing? We've heard about all these vehicles we've got at Warndon. We see the turnover with Knights taxis and all the other taxi firms in the spreadsheet. And we see the growth in EHCPs. We know what's on the national, you know, on the national level that's affecting lots of councils. But as an individual county council, we've known about this problem. for several years now, and we want to know what action our E&I department have taken to reduce the costs. And I suppose that one way, if you were looking at a private sector, you would say, okay, what's the average cost per SEND child to be taken to school? Is the trend going up? Is it going down? Is it steady? All right, where are we? And that's what we want to see. As a panel, looking at this from the sidelines, we want to know what you're doing about it to make us more efficient in taking these SEND children to school. And that's really what we want.
I'm going to just interject here and remind everybody that the next meeting of Children's and Families Overview Scrutiny panel, I'm looking at it here, they have home to school transport update.
So it has been requested.
Which has been requested, and it's going to the 27th of Jan. And Alistair, I'm hoping you'll be able to attend that as well. And
So is it going to that committee rather than ours?
yes is the answer. It's one of those that is cross-cutting, isn't it? But what we'll do is invite Alistair's panel to attend as well. So you'll have two panels effectively because it's cross-cutting. And Alistair, I'm sure would appreciate the opportunity. So can we postpone any further discussion on this and just allow this? I think you've trailblazed it really well, Alistair.
All right, can I just ask?
Understand.
Can I just ask that Paul agrees to follow up that request that I gave him, that outside this meeting, he actually gives me some list of what we've actually done since the 1st of April, and that would be really helpful if he can.
Well, I think the answer, not just for you, I think we're all interested, Alistair. I think we would expect the presentation at that meeting I've just described to include specifically, it's a very robust challenge, what with a tangible outcome have we achieved in the first 2 quarters of this year, I think is the question. And I think we need to have that addressed
I've
at
understood
that meeting.
that. Clearly, I will go back to E&I and I will ask the director to provide that. Absolutely. And I'm happy to answer questions on it.
Okay, that's great. Brandon.
Thank you, Chair. I have 2 questions. The one is following the election, the Labour government put in their manifesto, they would do a national care service. Now, I quote, undertake a programme to reform to create a national care service underpinned by national standards delivering consistency of care across the country. Services will be delivered locally. Now, on this, there are going to be councils who will receive money and councils will not receive money, depending where they are on the table and where they're spending on the care service. Paul, could you tell us whereabout we would be? Because if we are low, we might be getting more money. If not, if we're too high, we might be getting less money.
Because Stephen Kinnock, the Minister, came along to the CCN and he was asked to describe what the National Care Service is, and he said it was going to be co-produced with the sector. So that was the answer. So there isn't obviously a blueprint, and if there is one, we haven't seen it, councils haven't seen it, as to what a national care service is actually going to mean in the fundamentals of how it's going to be delivered. So we don't know, so we're not able to describe that to you. To be fair to the government, if I was generous, well, I think what the Minister was saying is we want to work with councils and other providers to work out actually what's going to happen, what changes. But he wasn't able to describe the vision of a national care service at that conference. He was asked twice by a very simple question from the audience, and he answered in that way. So I can only impart the answer that I wish and other people received at the conference. In terms of the here and now, of course, the issue is the pressures that we're facing in terms of social care, children's and adults to a certain extent. But on the adult social care side, obviously, one of the key things is where those costs arise. And a bit like, I hate to say homeschool transport, I'll leave it shut. But there are some things where actually there is great value for money, and there are relatively low costs and low interventions that we can make in people's lives that help keep them independent and at home. You know, very small additions, whether it's pieces of equipment, aids, adaptations. And actually, I can say that some of those are done very effectively and efficiently. We get really good reports from people in terms of some of the services we put in, which helps nip things in the bud, or helps people come out of hospital in a quicker fashion, go back home and stay in their own home. Many people want to do that. Personally, I think that's absolutely the right thing where it meets their needs. But where we see quite a bit of that cost is where you have more specialist provision, or people end up in nursing residential care, or as I said, we always focus, and even I focus on the older age group. The working age and lifelong conditions is actually where you've got numbers coming through, and there will be people who will come off EHCPs and other assessments at a children's level, and there'll be a lot fewer, but some of those will need a level of care and support throughout their life. And so there's been an excellent report. It's about that thick. It's well worth reading. I have a copy in the office if anyone wants to borrow it, or it is available online from the CCN. I have read it cover to cover. I think it's an excellent document that we helped work with the CCN to actually model the evidence for. So we're one of the councils they looked at in social care to provide the background data. We put a lot of effort into that because actually it's the big challenge for government about what do we do, bit like we're talking about in terms of the children's sector. What do you do for people which are living with complex conditions, more of them, for longer, in a society where we want people to be active, we actually want people to be able to work, have a meaningful life in terms of what they experience. That's absolutely right and proper. I think that's to be accepted. Nobody in this room would disagree with that. But how do we do that within an envelope that's affordable in terms of putting that wraparound support? And it probably isn't the way the sector's approached it in the past. There's also, coming down the line, obviously, still inspections. They're still talking about, the inspection regime around CQC, around adult social care, a bit like children's Ofsted. And this is another massive part of the council that will be subject to regular reviews. And again, you can have your own views about whether it's right and proper and to what extent that's going to drive service provision. But that's certainly, I think, Brandon, that's our here and now. In terms of what we're battling with. In terms of the formula around adult social care, I've got more confidence that probably reflects some of the drivers of need than I do around the deprivation formula, which I think is opaque. We don't know how it's going to work, and therefore the £700 million sat in there, our old 1% rule of thumb, I think is not going to work for us. But I'm conscious that Phil's been involved in quite a bit of...
Yeah, I'll come to Phil in a moment. On the National Care Service, I think that the position is... there was some talk, wasn't there, about whether or not we'd be closer to the NHS. That seems to have gone. So there were some rumours before the election about will it be combined with the NHS and adult social care and one thing or another. I think the Minister's been pretty clear that that's not their intention at the moment. They are looking for it still to stay with local authorities, but they are looking to get closer and more standardised sorts of care levels across the country. When we talk to them about what will that mean financially, which is the point you're making, what they say to us is fair funding review. Yeah. So that's what they say. So everything comes back to the fair funding review, which is next year, and that's the point that Simon was making earlier about we need to really be lobbying hard about that demand-driven service at that point, because if they want us to have this National Care Service and they want to move it forward in that way, they will have to fund it, because you can't have, they were talking a little bit about the postcode lottery. Well, of course, if you're paying for your adult social care precept out of your council tax, every postcode will be different, because ultimately the different levels of council tax. So they've got some fundamental things that we are pushing back to say, if you want this to be a national position, you're going to have to really think about how you fund it.
Just on the finance as well, the policy statement on the 28th of November would have all the policy changes in there. Nothing very silent on that. The only thing that has changed for adult social care is how it's displayed on the council tax bills. It's going to be a bit more simplified. So I think it's Paul and Simon are quite correct. It's one for the one post next year.
Yeah. Now, my other question, because on my particular committee, did the the money is not from the council as such, it's from government grants. And one of the grants which we discussed at my last committee meeting was the domestic abuse one, and the other grants as well. I know you mentioned first of all about the it won't be till the 19th. Have we had any indication whether these type of grants for domestic abuse or other thing is going to go up or down?
I think on the grants, we will be waiting until next week, and the government have made an indication of simplifying. There's too many pots of money in different areas. So they're going to aggregate a number of grants. There should be an audit trail with the settlement to see where we're going to fund, but we're still waiting. There's a letter saying it's imminent, but with no details in terms of that. So I think everything will be wrapped up in the settlement next week when we get it, and I think that's all we know at this point in time.
We will all keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you. Last but not least. Oh no, sorry, James, you're going to be last. So I wanted to talk actually about the cost of borrowing because I've spoken quite a bit about invest to save. I agree that where we can make savings if we have either extra capital investments such as SEND provision in local schools to reduce homeschool transport. It's right for children, it's right for the environment, less cars going on long journeys. Head teachers would welcome that because they also see the harm in children having to do very long journeys twice a day. But of course, that's all underpinned by the cost of borrowing. And what's that looking like at the moment? I know, again, next week we're waiting for the Bank of England to tell us what the new interest rate will be. At the moment it's 4.75. It is on a trajectory that it's coming down very slowly. Are we expecting to see that? But of course, we can also normally borrow from West Midlands Combined Authority or other councils. How is that looking? How are we looking in that sphere of being able to borrow and do that effectively to be able to therefore then save money on projects?
I'll bring in Phil to give you all the technical view, but actually you'll notice that if you added up all those numbers I gave you, that's more than our total in terms of the overspend, and that's because on MRP, minimum revenue provision, we've been able to make continuing savings, and we've been managing the capital programme, the spend, that's actually been a real a boost to the budget. It's been able to help us in a really important year in terms of making savings. So we have that corporate activity that sometimes people are not sure what it's doing. Actually is really, really effective in terms of managing our borrowing and limiting the borrowing. We do a lot of internal borrowing rather than going out to the marketplace and placing resources. Obviously, we have to be cognizant of protecting the principal sum, of liquidity. You know, those are really important factors rather than return. That isn't the top factor. But the reality is that's really helped to many, many millions. I think it's about £7 or £8 million off the top of my head. Phil's nodding, which is always a good sign. You know, we don't talk about that £7 or £8 million benefit to the programme, but that's our overspend would be substantially higher if we didn't have that active management. One thing I would mention, which we haven't talked about, is the pension fund changes. And they could materially impact our budget as well. Because, of course, we do have LPS Central, and other funds. But one of the other things we haven't described this morning, again, medium term, not immediate, but the government is indicating very firmly that local authorities will be expected to pool their resources in terms of these pooled regional funds. There is a question mark, obviously, if the liabilities for paying out sits with us, but we have less control over the direct investments. That doesn't sound like a risk that's going the right way to me. That sounds like the risk and the cost's going to sit with us, but other people are going to make decisions over very large sums of money and investments. And if they're directed to support UK investments as opposed to being diversified and global, as the current case is, there is potential for, if things go wrong, those risks to materialise in additional costs to the fund, because obviously we have to underwrite that. We have a fund that's very well performing. We've picked it up from being underfunded to being effectively fully or overfunded now. We've also received a benefit of that. We've been able to reduce our contributions. So those small things that go on in the background are not small at all. They're very, very substantial for our budget. Just on the capital programme, I'm always ambitious on the capital programme because I always think actually our job is to invest in Worcestershire, invest in the place, invest in the provision. And I didn't intervene and come into the homeschool debate, but I do think there is a case, and we are making that case as administration, to constantly look at could we help and support schools that, of course, our relationship is so different than 20 or 30 years with academies and all the other stuff. But can we support them to look at reasonable vision in the locality to help support children to stay local? Because, of course, that cuts out the transport virtually at a stroke, takes it away. And I think that is better in many cases for the children. I think it's better for their learning. Obviously, it has to be an appropriate setting with the right support. So that obviously has a revenue implication for schools as well. But if relatively small amounts of capital could help facilitate that, could oil that particular wheel, then we're cognizant of that and we're supportive of that, because I think that's better all round. Paul is right to say, of course, if the EHCP says you may believe that's a suitable alternative provision, but we don't, and that goes to appeal and is lost, then even if we've made the provision, as that may well be the case in some cases, that could prescribe a setting other than the local setting, even if we'd done all that. But as an ever optimistic man, I always think this nonsense needs to change nationally. There needs to be a reappraisal of the legislation. And so forward-leaning councils showing the way about how you can do things differently to provide local facilities and settings which are appropriate to need, surely that's the kind of thing any government looking to make efficiencies and savings would be prepared to look at and say, we're happy to support that kind of thing. And maybe we need to moderate our legislation and the very prescribed nature of it to accommodate where the council's done its best endeavours or made reasonable provision. And so we will be in a better provision, in my view, if we're leaning into that space and trying to drive the debate and being able to give local examples of within the very prescriptive world we live in, we're able to do that. I think that's a better way. But I'll leave Phil to do the detail.
Thank you. I think just in terms of our borrowing, we've got around about 553 million of debt at the moment, when the average rate for all that debt, and we spread it over the maturity, is about 3.6%. So rates we can get, there is an active local authority market as well at the moment with authorities with extra cash. So borrowing is an option so long as the business case stacks up. I would say in terms of where it goes forward, but the borrowing cost does impact on the revenue budget. So obviously more the borrow, the more the interest rates and the principal you've got to pay and the minimum revenue provision. So there's going to be some tough choices around what we do in the capital programme going forward, because if we're challenged on a revenue perspective. And I think one of the areas that frustrates me is from the government, you've got a DSG that covers, it's meant to be a dedicated schools grant, it shouldn't cost the local taxpayer. So it should be funded formally. And the other side of the equation as well is new schools, that should be funded by the government. The government don't put a lot of money into SEND. We get some areas of funding, but we have to, if there's a school, we have Section 106, is that we have to basically cash flow it. But there should be some areas if it's going to make a big impact on, obviously homeschool transport will be marginal, but the biggest impact will be on the SEND budget in terms of getting that £84 million down. So how do we manage that? Because if we do schools, we're going to have choices around roads, capital, other side of capital, so there's going to be some difficult choices the authority makes, but borrowing is an option. But for me as your 151 officer, it's got to be prudent and sustainable, and that's the challenge where we are at the moment.
Thank you. No, that's all very interesting. But obviously I have spoken about not just within the capital project to spend to save, but also when we're looking at fostering, and how we can retain foster carers, but also then introduce more people into the system. And when I look at this myself, I think, well, actually, I would have to stop working in order to foster care. So how are we making it so that people can see this as a legitimate way of giving back to society, but they're not financially burdened because of it? So, how are we looking to increase that food payout?
I think you've been talking to Councillor Kent, probably. So this is Councillor Kent's constant line with us. It's certainly an opinion that we are exploring. So we've recently brought in what we've called super foster carers. Not that they are any different to all of our foster carers are brilliant. But it's exactly that point you're making. So we are looking at paying, we pay £1,000 a week, and they are taking some of our children who are slightly more challenging, so they would be more costly if they were in residential. It's better for the child, and it's paying a reasonable amount of money that means they can do this as an occupation. We're also looking at whether or not we could increase that further, because what we found is there are people who are interested. Of course, you have to pass all of the tests. It's not just simply demand of people coming forward. You have to pass all of the checks and balances and all of the right and proper person type checks to make sure children are safe. But assuming that's the case, we're still not getting that many people come forward. So we are looking at, with Councillor Kent, about maybe we should move that money up again. Because actually there is lots of headroom compared to a residential placement, which is anything between £4,000 and £6,000 a week. So, you know, even if we're spending £2,000 a week or £3,000 a week, it's still half price. And it comes back to Alistair's point about efficiency. Is there a different way to do it? So we are absolutely looking at that in our revenue spend. We've got 12, I think now, is it 12, Phil, super foster carers? We are constantly going out. You will remember the magazine the council produced. It was all about fostering. We will continue those messages, but we are also trying to talk to people to say, what is the barrier? And it could quite well be that point as, is there effectively almost like a community job in this? That you know, your job is really doing a very important role for what the community needs to be done. So we're absolutely doing those things. It's a practical thing we've actually started doing, and we're constantly looking about saying, where is that sweet spot of cost versus benefit?
Just to add to that, because that's absolutely right, and I think it's actually one of the highlights of the year, really, in terms of looking at how we can. It's better for the child if they're in a setting that's it's a family environment, even though it's not their traditional birth family. It's a family as opposed to a care home and care provision. But we're also looking in the care sector, and we've done some work with Empower, not just on the fostering side, but also on their valuing care model, which is a model they've been rolling out to a number of councils in the UK, to make sure that where children are coming into care, that the assessment of the child and the assessment of the capacity and capability of the centre that's taking them are matched. So it isn't just about what's available at that particular time, but actually it's making sure that children's needs are more closely aligned with the provider and their setting. And what we're finding there is a mismatch in some cases. And so where that mismatch is happening, where we can have a managed move of the child between a provider, obviously there's a lot of work that has to be done around that, but where it's in the child's interest and it's obviously in the council's interest and the provider's interest to make that move, then we're doing so. And again, Empower have been looking at that to say, can you do more? You know, how is that working? And assessing that. So in both of those areas, I think we've been making quite good strides. It's been an area of progress where I feel more optimistic. The numbers are still, in terms of the costs, relentless. But you have to do everything, I believe, locally that we can do within the discretions and flexibilities we have to make sure we have the best provision for the child, but at the most value for money provision, really. So it's a key. Steve's the portfolio holder, but Adam's providing a level of challenge from an economy and market perspective, which is right, and we try and do that within the cabinet so that you don't have a fixed view.
Okay, I've just noted that the Children's Panel, which is going to be busy next week, is also looking at this issue, actually. So anyone who's got particular interest in that, please rock on. Please come along to that meeting, which is next Tuesday?
Wednesday, is it?
Wednesday? 17th, whenever the 17th is. Yeah, should be interesting. Okay, my Vice Chairman.
Chair, thanks very much. we've spoken at length about costs. One of the costs that we have referred to, but not yet specifically, is legal costs, because we're talking about the appeals process. Reference has been made to the fact that 90% of occasions the council has been found against. What I'd like a little bit more clarity on, if possible, is exactly, I mean, clearly KCs and the whole raft of the legal paraphernalia involved here doesn't come cheap. Yeah. How much does this cost? Because clearly that we're talking about thresholds. How much officers feel there's some mileage in promoting that particular line of we go down that route, whether it's something we best not go into at all. Clearly, if we're going to manage costs more effectively, how much does this particular area of the council's business really impact on what sort of cost implications did it have?
It's a really good question. It's not a huge impact because we don't take that many at the moment. We tend to look at the case law, and our internal legal department will say, if you take that, you're going to lose. And therefore we will do it. But there are one or two that we will take. Having said that, our children's services and our adult services are massively busy at the moment in legal. Huge number of new things coming through. Legal as a team is overspent, so in all of the Chief Exec's department, we're all underspent apart from legal, and we are teen and ladling budgets from other areas to actually keep that going. We are struggling to retain solicitors, particularly childcare solicitors. They're in very, very big demand, and that once, if we lose solicitors, we've lost a couple in the last couple of months, we inevitably have to then put the work out, which is considerably more expensive than having in-house legal. So we are doing a full review of legal. Hazel is on with that at the moment. We are looking to right-size it so we reduce our external costs. Again, this efficiency point. But it is very, very busy. So it's not particularly the appeals against home to school transport or that, but we do get them on doles, deprivation of liberty. We get them on all kinds of things across that. And of course, there is the taking of children into care, which is the priority area where we're going to court for orders to remove children or to place them into protective situations where we need the judge to do it. We have been criticised by the judge in Worcestershire of being too slow to get some of the papers ready and various other things, because we've had all of these efficiency drives in the background to try and reduce our costs. There are some challenges there sometimes where we want to do everything electronically, but they want the paper-wise, and we're moving to a paperless office, and therefore when we have to produce things paper-wise, it's more difficult. We've resolved that. We've put that in place, but it is very, very busy. So ultimately, our legal costs are higher than we had budgeted for. But it's not just specifically due to that issue, because we tend to look at that regionally and nationally about what is the case law. So as each case goes through the tribunal, we obviously all get that reported back, and we look at, if that's the same as our case, then we already know that that's the position. But if precedent isn't there, then we will push that particular point to establish whether or not the council has that ability to make that discretion.
Okay. I'm going to turn to these officers to my left, and I usually say, is there anything you'd like to ask the leader? Now, because you've sat and listened to all the questions and answers, so unusually, I should get into huge trouble for this. If there is anything you'd like to ask these chaps over here, then this would be the moment.
No, thank you, Chairman.
Okay, they're going to decline, which is a shame. Guys, I don't know what I was expecting this morning, but what I've received is quite stark, and you've painted a very honest picture of where we are right now, and obviously we're all waiting with bated breath for the government announcement next week. it's the same old areas plus one or two emerging, actually, some new areas are beginning to emerge as in terms of cost pressures, as well as the three that we're familiar with. The panels will be, in the next few weeks, requiring attendance by the relevant officers and cabinet members as they go through in fine detail each of the budget heads. I think one of the messages I got this morning is the concern that we might see at a national level a reapportionment of money towards the metropolitan areas under the umbrella of tackling deprivation, but possibly excluding and not understanding a demand-led pressures that we have and will continue to have, where we have always had these issues. We may not be in a black hole, according to the Telegraph, but we're probably not far off it. And I think Alistair's frustration this morning was that, we need some tangible evidence of more than just mapping pupil movement, but actually doing something. And I think the other message I've got, Simon, from you particularly, is the need to reform legislation and regulation, and even the inspection regime, if we're going to be viable. And so much that we heard this morning was about, well, we can't do that. We're not allowed to do that. We can't put a charge on the property and get the money back we've invested in DFGs. We can't change the way we take children to their education because we are, by regulation, required to do X, Y, and Z. But something's going to have to give. One way or another, something's going to have to give, because we are now dealing with an unsustainable medium-term financial plan in the way I used to remember them, with some comfort looking at what 227-28 looked like, where we might be in 228-29, and we just can't do that with the same certainty anymore. We can't do that, and that's a concern, because we appear to be living from one year to the next in the hope of a settlement. The 2-year settlement, that's some way off. Disappointing it can't do it now. Another year. Spending review, well, okay. Where does that take us in terms of medium-term financial plan? So it's a concern that I'm taking away this morning, that all 57 members of this council, whether they're part of the administration or whoever they may be, we are members of an organisation where we have, collectively, putting aside politics, quite a challenging situation emerging. And I think all 57 members need to have some ownership of that in a very grown-up way. And I'm wondering whether just the panels is going to be sufficient to get that ownership, and wonder whether a member's briefing might be something that we might think of unusually in these circumstances, where a very objective and honest briefing, in the way that you've been so candid this morning, might be something we might want to consider in these very unusual circumstances, once we know what the settlement is, so we can begin to piece together a medium-term financial plan that we understand, that is sustainable, and the challenges ahead. So I don't know whether that's an option we might pursue. The budget day itself is not a day for that, really, because we know we're going to get the usual grandstanding on that occasion. It's sort of like a pantomime, really. Something more serious and grown up needs to take place if members of this council are going to be fully appraised of where we are. So we thank you for what you do. We thank you particularly in these really, really difficult circumstances. It can't be a lot of fun being a leader of this council right now, or leader of any council. Actually, I'm quite pleased I'm not a leader of council anymore. So thank you guys for your attendance this morning. We'll probably have a couple of minutes comfort break and then we'll reconvene, if that's okay.